just sold my company for $20 million, I whispered, dropping the glossy Forbes magazine with my face on the cover right onto my mother's pristine Thanksgiving plate. Enjoy the turkey. Have you ever poured your entire soul into a passion, only for your own family to treat it like a silly, worthless joke? Share your experiences in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe. But long before that magazine ever hit the dining table, I had to survive a lifetime of quietly sitting in their shadows. I always knew I was the odd one out in the Miller family. While my older brother David paraded his law degree like a badge of ultimate honor, and my cousin Sarah proudly displayed her medical scrubs at every family gathering, I was the girl hunched over a glowing screen. My mother, Eleanor, had a specific vision of success. It involved corner offices, prestigious titles, and a predictable path that she could easily brag about to her friends at the country club. My world, written in lines of code, late-night debugging sessions, and endless cups of cheap coffee, was invisible to her. Worse, it was a disappointment. "You're still playing around with those computers, Maya?" she would ask, her voice dripping with that distinct, polite condescension only a mother could master. "It's a nice hobby, sweetheart, but when are you going to find a real career?" I never fought back. I just swallowed the lump in my throat, smiled politely, and went back to my apartment. They didn't understand that my stupid tech hobby wasn't just a phase. It was a lifeline. It was an idea that had blossomed into a startup, a piece of software that was quietly revolutionizing how small businesses manage their logistics. But to my mother, if it didn't come with a shiny corporate nameplate, it wasn't real. I spent my 20s feeling like a ghost at the dinner table. I was the cautionary tale, the daughter who hadn't quite figured it out. I carried that weight silently, letting their whispers fuel my late-night coding. I told myself that one day, my work would speak louder than their expectations. I just didn't realize how loud it would eventually be. The final weeks leading up to November were a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. My startup, the little project born in my cramped living room, had caught the eye of a major tech conglomerate in Silicon Valley. The negotiations were grueling, filled with endless virtual calls and stacks of digital legal documents that made my eyes ache. When the final contract was signed, transferring ownership for a staggering $20 million, I sat alone on my thrift store sofa and cried. It wasn't just about the money. It was the ultimate validation of my entire existence. I had built something meaningful from absolutely nothing. Shortly after the sale, Forbes reached out. They wanted me for a feature on rising female innovators. The photo shoot felt surreal. Sitting in a bright studio with professional lighting, a far cry from my usual oversized hoodies and messy bums. When the advanced copy of the magazine arrived in my mail, I traced the glossy cover with trembling fingers. My face stared back at me, confident, sharp, and undeniable. I didn't call my mother. I didn't text my brother. The silence between us had grown too thick over the years. Every time I had tried to share a small victory in the past, a successful beta test, a new client, it had been met with polite nods and immediate subject changes. I was tired of begging for a seat at their table of accomplishments. This time, I decided to wait. Thanksgiving was only a few days away. I packed my overnight bag, carefully sliding the pristine copy of Forbes into my tote. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dreading the holiday. I felt a strange, quiet armor settling heavily over my shoulders. Driving up the familiar gravel driveway of my childhood home, the scent of roasting turkey and wood smoke drifted through the crisp November air. The house was decorated perfectly, a testament to my mother's flawless hosting skills. Autumnal wreaths hung on the heavy wooden doors, and the glow of warm light spilled onto the porch. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my coat and my tote bag, feeling the reassuring, solid weight of the magazine inside. As soon as I stepped through the door, the noise washed over me. The clinking of crystal wine glasses, the booming laugh of my Uncle Richard, the sharp, fast-paced chatter of my cousins. My mother was holding court in the kitchen, impeccably dressed in a silk blouse, directing the household chaos with a wooden spoon. "Maya, you made it," she said, offering a tight, brief hug that barely disturbed her posture. "I was beginning to think your little computer games had kept you completely." "Hi, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. I didn't take the bait. I walked into the living room, immediately cornered by David, who was already 2 drinks in and eager to discuss his latest promotion to senior partner at the firm. I listened politely, nodding at the right intervals, smiling as the rest of the family chimed in with their loud congratulations. I felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. They were so wrapped up in their defined metrics of success that they didn't even notice the shift in my demeanor. I wasn't shrinking into the background anymore. I was simply waiting, watching the familiar gears of our family dynamics turn, knowing that the script was about to change forever. The dining table was a masterpiece of fine china, polished silver, and folded linen. We all took our designated seats, a hierarchy established long ago. I was seated near the end, safely out of the crossfire of the important conversations. As the turkey was carved and the steaming side dishes were passed around, the table buzzed with updates. David's law firm, Sarah's hospital residency, Uncle Richard's stock portfolio. It was a symphony of self-importance. Eventually, as it always did, the spotlight swung my way. It was never out of genuine curiosity, but rather a need for a contrasting baseline, a way for the rest of them to feel better about their own traditional achievements. My mother wiped her mouth elegantly with a napkin and looked down the length of the table at me. The chatter died down, a collective holding of breath as the audience prepared for the familiar show. "So, Maya," she began, her tone carrying effortlessly over the quiet room, pointing her fork slightly in my direction. "Are you still playing around with that stupid tech hobby of yours?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. My cousin Sarah smirked into her wineglass. David shook his head with a patronizing sigh. "It's almost a new year, darling," my mother continued, her voice taking on that faux sympathetic edge that cut deeper than any shout ever could. "Maybe next year you'll finally grow up, put those toys away, and get a real job. Your brother could probably get you an administrative position at his firm if you just ask." The whole table smirked, a chorus of silent pity. My heart hammered in my chest, not from shame, but from a profound, breaking realization. They really didn't know me at all. I didn't blush. I didn't look down at my plate like I had for the past 10 years of these dinners. Instead, I quietly picked up my wine glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down softly. The quiet clink seemed to echo in the sudden, heavy silence of the dining room. I reached down into my tote bag resting by my feet. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Every eye at the table tracked my movement, confusion starting to replace the smugness on their faces. I walked slowly up the length of the long table until I stood directly beside my mother's chair. Without a word, I pulled the pristine copy of this month's Forbes magazine from my bag. I let it drop. It landed squarely on her empty salad plate with a heavy, satisfying thud. The glossy cover caught the light of the overhead chandelier. There I was, arms crossed, looking powerful under the bold headline. My mother blinked, her eyes darting frantically from my real face to the cover and back again. The smirk on Sarah's face vanished instantly, replaced by an open-mouthed stare. David froze, his wineglass halfway to his lips. I leaned down, bracing my hands on the back of my mother's chair, bringing my face close to hers. My voice was completely steady, a calm whisper that carried easily in the dead silent room. "I just sold my company for $20 million, I whispered. "Enjoy the turkey." I stood up straight, turned on my heel, and walked out of the dining room. I grabbed my coat from the hallway. I didn't look back. The only sound left in the room was the front door clicking shut behind me. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of highway lights and blinding clarity. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. But for the first time in years, my chest felt incredibly light. The heater blasted warm air into the chilly November night, thawing the lingering frost of my mother's dining room. I had done it. I had finally spoken my truth, delivered my undeniable proof, and walked away. Yet, as I merged onto the interstate, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a hollow, aching resonance in the pit of my stomach. I pulled over at a deserted gas station, put the car in park, and finally let the tears fall. They weren't tears of regret or guilt. I was grieving. I was mourning the painful realization that my family's respect came with a price tag. For 28 years, my passion, my late nights, and my quiet resilience hadn't been enough to earn a single word of encouragement. It took a $20 million buyout and a glossy magazine cover for me to even exist in their world. The victory I had just claimed tasted overwhelmingly like ash. I rested my forehead against the cold leather of the steering wheel, letting the silence of the empty parking lot wash over me. I had money now, more money than I could ever spend, but I had never felt more entirely alone. The fantasy of them suddenly realizing my worth and pulling me into a warm, apologetic embrace had shattered the moment I saw their faces. They weren't proud, they were just shocked. I wiped my eyes, shifted the car into drive, and headed toward the city, leaving the ghosts of my childhood firmly in the rearview mirror. By the time I unlocked the door to my modest apartment, my phone was burning a hole in my coat pocket. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and finally pulled the device out. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications. 8 missed calls from my mother, 5 from David, a barrage of frantic text messages from my cousin, Sarah. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the glowing names, feeling a strange mix of power and profound exhaustion. I pressed play on the first voicemail. It was my mother. "Maya, sweetheart," her voice trilled through the speaker, breathless and laced with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. We were entirely caught off guard. You should have told us, darling." "Goodness, leaving the table like that. Please come back. We have so much to celebrate. We kept your plate warm." I deleted the message before it even finished. There was no apology for her cruel remarks. There was no acknowledgement of the humiliation she had tried to orchestrate just an hour prior. She just wanted the successful daughter back at her table to complete the picture. Next was David's voicemail. "Maya, it's David. Listen, Mom is a wreck. You really pulled a dramatic exit there, didn't you? Look, $20 million is a huge deal. We need to talk about wealth management, taxes. You need advice. Call me back immediately." I turned the phone off completely, tossing it onto the nightstand. They didn't see me as a sister or a daughter. I had simply transformed from an embarrassment into an asset. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, seeking comfort in the dark, silent room. The winter months passed with agonizing slowness. I moved out of my cramped apartment and into a bright, spacious loft downtown, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. I hired a brilliant financial advisor, donated a quiet fortune to a women's tech initiative, and began sketching out ideas for my next venture. To the outside world, I was living the absolute dream. I was independent, wealthy, and completely autonomous. But inside, the silence of my new home was deafening. The holidays had been brutal. I spent Christmas Day alone, ordering takeout and watching old movies, deliberately ignoring the stack of festive, handwritten cards my mother had mailed to my new address. Each card was filled with generic pleasantries, asking when I would come to my senses and visit. Not a single word of genuine reflection. The emotional distance between us had solidified into an impenetrable wall of ice. I missed the idea of a family. I missed the comforting illusion that someone out there had my back unconditionally. Some evenings, I would stand by the glass windows, looking out at the glittering city lights, wondering if I had made a mistake by cutting them off so abruptly. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the smirk on Sarah's face and the cold, dismissive tone of my mother's voice. I realized that setting boundaries isn't just about keeping toxic people out. It's about protecting the fragile peace you fought so hard to build. I was finally learning to be my own family. It was a rainy Tuesday in early March when my past finally caught up with me. I was sitting at my favorite corner booth in a local coffee shop, reviewing a stack of promising new startup pitches, when a shadow fell over my table. I looked up to see David standing there, shaking the rain from his expensive designer trench coat. He looked older, his face etched with a nervous tension I had never seen on him before. "The barista told me you usually work from here on Tuesdays," he said, sliding into the booth across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Hello, David," I replied evenly, slowly closing my laptop. "What are you doing here?" He offered a tight, uncomfortable smile. "It's been months, Maya." "Mom is beside herself. You won't return her calls. You blocked my number. I had to hire a private investigator just to find out where you moved." I felt a cold spike of anger in my chest. "You hired an investigator? That's crossing a massive line, David. If I wanted to be found, I would have answered the phone." He held up his hands defensively. "Okay, I know, I'm sorry. But we are family. You can't just vanish into thin air because of a little misunderstanding at dinner. Mom has a sharp tongue, you know that. You need to let it go. We need to move past this." A little misunderstanding. The sheer invalidation of his words took my breath away. He was still doing it, minimizing my pain to prioritize their comfort. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I said softly, my voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "It was a lifetime of disrespect." David sighed, running a hand through his damp hair, looking visibly exasperated. "Fine. You want an apology? Consider this an apology. I'm sorry Mom was rude. But honestly, Maya, I didn't come all the way across town just to play family therapist." I leaned back against the booth, crossing my arms. "Then why did you come?" He leaned forward, dropping his voice into a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. "My firm is expanding. I'm branching out, starting my own boutique practice. It's a guaranteed success, Maya. I have the clients, the expertise. All I need is the initial capital. The banks are being painfully slow, and I thought, well, keeping it in the family makes the most sense." I stared at him, the reality of the situation washing over me like a bucket of ice water. He hadn't hunted me down because he missed his sister. He didn't care about the emotional wreckage of Thanksgiving. He was here for a loan. I was nothing more than a convenient ATM. "You want me to invest in your firm," I stated, stripping all emotion from my voice. "Exactly," he smiled, looking relieved that I seemingly understood. "It's a win-win. You have capital just sitting around, and I can give you a solid return on the investment." "No," I said instantly. His smile faltered. "What? Maya, be reasonable. You have $20 million. "And not a single cent of it is for you," I whispered, packing my laptop into my bag. "You don't want a sister, David. You want a bank, and my vault is securely closed." I stood up, leaving him stunned in the booth, and walked out into the rain. The walk back to my loft in the pouring rain felt like a physical cleanse. Every cold drop striking my heavy coat seemed to wash away another layer of the suffocating guilt I had carried for months. David's blatant attempt to use me had been deeply painful, but it was also profoundly liberating. The last lingering fantasy that my family genuinely loved me for who I was had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, undeniable truth. When I finally reached my apartment, I dried off, made a cup of herbal tea, and sat by the window overlooking the gray, weeping city. I wasn't angry anymore. I just felt incredibly sad for them. They were so trapped in their rigid, shallow definitions of worth that they were missing out on actual human connection. I spent the next few weeks throwing myself into my new venture, a mentorship program for young, underprivileged girls interested in coding. It was fulfilling, demanding work that gave my days structure and my heart a sense of purpose that Thanksgiving dinners never could.
Yet, the absolute silence from my family, now that I had officially cut off their financial access, was a different kind of heavy. I had drawn my line in the sand, and they had chosen not to cross it. I thought that was the definitive end of our story.
I had resigned myself to a life entirely separate from the Miller family, finding a steady peace in the quiet, secure sanctuary I had built for myself. I was moving forward, step by step. But life, I was quickly learning, rarely adheres to the neat, tidy boundaries we try to draw around our hearts. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 months after my harsh encounter with David in the coffee shop. My phone vibrated violently on my oak desk, the caller ID flashing a local hospital's number. Reluctantly, assuming it was a billing error or a wrong number, I answered. It was my cousin, Sarah. Her voice, usually so sharp, confident, and dripping with superiority, was barely a trembling whisper. "Maya," she choked out, the undeniable sound of sterile hospital monitors beeping faintly in the background. "It's Aunt Eleanor, your mom. She collapsed this morning at the country club. It's her heart." The floor seemed to immediately drop out from under me. All the righteous anger, the carefully constructed emotional walls, the months of practiced indifference, they vanished in a single terrifying heartbeat. "Which hospital?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the sudden, freezing ice in my veins. Sarah hastily gave me the details, her usual condescension completely replaced by raw, unfiltered fear. "They don't know how bad it is yet, Maya. They are running tests. But she's asking for you. Only you." I hung up the phone and stood entirely frozen in my beautiful, lonely loft. This was the exact moment I had deeply dreaded. The universe was forcing me back into the orbit of the woman who had caused me so much pain. I could have stayed. I had every right to stay away, to protect my hard-won peace. But as I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, I realized something vital. My boundaries were designed to keep cruelty out, not to block my own basic humanity. She was still my mother. The hospital waiting room was a suffocating, fluorescent-lit sea of beige chairs and anxious silence. When I arrived, David and Sarah were huddled in a far corner, looking like terrified children rather than successful adults. David looked utterly defeated, his usual arrogant, chest-out posture replaced by a slumped, panicked stance. He looked up as I approached, a wave of genuine relief washing over his tired, pale face. "You came," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "She's in the cardiac ICU. They stabilized her for now, but it was a massive scare, a severe arrhythmia." I simply nodded, offering no platitudes or empty words of comfort, deeply reserving my emotional energy for the room down the hall. A weary, soft-spoken nurse finally approached us, calling my name gently. "She's awake now, but please, keep it brief. Her heart is exceptionally weak." I followed the nurse down the brightly lit, sterile corridor, the sharp smell of antiseptic burning my nose. When I finally stepped into the dim room, the breath immediately caught in my throat. The formidable, impeccably dressed woman who had mocked me at Thanksgiving was completely gone. In her place lay a frail, pale figure hooked up to a terrifying array of blinking, beeping machines. Her silver hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, was messy and plastered to her damp forehead. She looked small, so incredibly small. As I cautiously approached the side of her bed, her eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, entirely devoid of their usual sharp, judging light. When her gaze finally landed on my face, a single trembling tear escaped the corner of her eye. I pulled a cold plastic chair close to the edge of her bed and sat down. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the rhythmic swoosh and beep of the vital monitors keeping watch over her. "Maya," she finally whispered, her voice incredibly raspy and weak, completely stripped of its usual commanding tone. "You came." "I'm here, Mom," I said, keeping my tone entirely neutral but gentle. She slowly, painfully turned her head toward me, her eyes filled with a desperate, raw kind of sorrow I had never witnessed in her before. "I was so terrible to you," she breathed, the confession seeming to cost her a great deal of physical effort. "All those years, I was so absolutely terrified you would fail and be left with nothing. I convinced myself that pushing you, mocking your dreams, would somehow force you into a safe, predictable life." I listened quietly, my heart aching, not just for her current physical vulnerability, but for the profound emotional blindness she had suffered from for decades. "You didn't protect me, Mom," I said softly, firmly refusing to let the painful truth be entirely buried under the weight of her illness. "You just broke my heart over and over." She closed her eyes tightly, more tears spilling over her pale lashes. I know it now. When I fell today, when my chest seized and everything went completely dark, all I could see was your face in that dining room, the way you looked at me. I thought that would be my very last memory." She reached out a trembling, ivy-bruised hand. I gently covered it with my own. The stressful days following my mother's cardiac collapse were a chaotic blur of hushed medical consultations and rapidly shifting family dynamics. David and Sarah, thoroughly humbled by the sudden, terrifying fragility of life, began treating me with a cautious, quiet new respect. There were no more subtle requests for investments, no more snide, whispering comments about my unconventional past. They finally saw me, perhaps for the very first time, not as a rebellious disappointment or a walking bank account, but as a steady, reliable anchor holding our fractured family together during a severe crisis. As my mother slowly, painstakingly regained her physical strength, our long conversations in that sterile hospital room gradually deepened. They certainly weren't always easy. There were still difficult moments of defensiveness, lingering echoes of our old, toxic habits, but her near-death experience had permanently cracked her pristine, judgmental armor. She genuinely began asking about my company, not the staggering $20 million buyout, but the actual grueling work. She wanted to hear about the complex software I had built, the agonizing sleepless nights I had endured, and the deep passion that had kept me going. It was the exact emotional validation I had desperately craved my entire life, arriving years late and under the most heartbreaking of circumstances. Sitting beside her bed, patiently explaining the intricacies of my tech architecture to a woman who barely knew how to operate a smartphone, I felt a profound, permanent shift within my own soul. The bitter, burning need to prove her wrong was finally fading away. In its place, a quiet, fragile hope began to take root. The day we finally brought my mother home from the hospital felt entirely surreal. The imposing brick house, which had always felt more like a museum of her achievements than a home, was suddenly filled with stark medical equipment. I took charge of coordinating her home care nurses and organizing her complicated medication schedule, treating the complex logistics with the same intense precision I used when building my software. My mother, who had once directed holiday dinners like a five-star general, now needed assistance just to walk from the living room to the kitchen. It was heartbreaking to witness her physical decline, yet in her profound physical weakness,
Her emotional walls had completely crumbled. She allowed me to help her without a single sigh of frustration or polite complaint. One afternoon, as I was carefully arranging her countless pill bottles on the pristine granite counter, she watched me quietly from her wheelchair.
"You are so incredibly capable, Maya," she murmured, her voice still entirely lacking its former sharp edge. "You manage everything with such effortless grace. I was always so terribly afraid you lacked discipline, but I was looking at you through the wrong lens entirely." I paused, holding a small amber bottle, and looked at her. It wasn't a grand, sweeping apology, but it was incredibly honest.
"My discipline just looks different than yours, Mom," I replied softly, placing the bottle down on the counter. She nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile touching her pale lips. The air in the house no longer felt suffocating and judgmental. Instead, it felt like a blank canvas, waiting for us to carefully paint a new, tentative reality together. A few weeks after my mother's discharge, my loft's intercom buzzed unexpectedly. It was David. My immediate instinct was to tense up, fully expecting another thinly veiled pitch for his boutique law firm. But when I opened the heavy wooden door, he was holding nothing but 2 large cups from the artisanal coffee shop down my street.
He looked utterly exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes standing out starkly against his pale skin. He walked in, taking a quiet moment to admire the massive windows and the city skyline, before silently handing me a cup. "I didn't come to ask for anything, Maya," he said preemptively, correctly reading the rigid hesitation in my posture. He sat down heavily on my leather sofa, staring blankly at his coffee lid. "I came to properly apologize. For the coffee shop, for Thanksgiving, for the last 10 years, honestly." I sat in the armchair opposite him, waiting in the quiet room. "When Mom collapsed," he continued, his voice thick with raw emotion, "I realized how completely fragile all of this is. They didn't mean a damn thing in that terrifying waiting room. You were the strong one. You were the only one who actually knew how to handle a real crisis." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability I had never witnessed in him before. "I reduced you to a walking ATM because I was terrified of failing on my own. I was deeply jealous, Maya. You built an empire in your living room, and I'm drowning in corporate debt." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a profound sense of closure. "I forgive you, David," I said gently. As the long summer months slowly faded into autumn, my mother's health stabilized and her cardiac rehab became a steady routine. During this time, I poured my energy into my mentorship program for young girls, renting out a small community center and filling it with donated laptops. I rarely spoke about it to my family, still instinctively protecting my fragile passions from their past judgment. However, one Sunday afternoon, my mother insisted on visiting my loft. She arrived looking much more like her old self, wearing a tasteful cashmere cardigan and leaning on a sleek silver cane. As I served her tea, her eyes fell upon a stack of glossy pamphlets I had printed for our upcoming winter tech showcase. She picked one up, carefully adjusting her reading glasses. I braced myself for the inevitable critique of the font choice or the cheap venue. Instead, she spent 10 quiet minutes reading every single word on the brochure. "These young girls," she finally spoke, her voice thick with unfeigned emotion. "You are teaching them how to confidently build their own futures. You are giving them the exact tools you had to figure out entirely on your own." I nodded, a heavy lump forming in my throat. "Yes," I answered simply. She carefully placed the pamphlet back on the table, looking me directly in the eyes. "The community center is much too small for a proper showcase, Maya. I am still the vice president of the country club's event committee. I want to secure the grand ballroom for your girls, fully catered, entirely on me." I stared at her, completely stunned. She wasn't just acknowledging my world, she was actively using her privilege to support it. November arrived with a bitter, biting chill, bringing with it the heavy, unavoidable anniversary of the Thanksgiving dinner that had completely shattered our family dynamic. The vivid memory of dropping that Forbes magazine on her pristine china plate still echoed in my mind, a complicated mix of necessary triumph and lingering sorrow. I had quietly assumed we would skip the holiday this year, or perhaps order a tense meal at a neutral restaurant. But a week before the dreaded Thursday, my mother called. Her voice was incredibly steady, bearing the quiet strength she had slowly reclaimed over the past few months. "Maya," she began gently, "I want to host Thanksgiving dinner this year, but I absolutely cannot do it alone. I am asking if you would come over early and help me cook." It was a massive, unprecedented concession. Her kitchen had always been her exclusive, heavily guarded domain, a stage where she perfectly performed her domesticity. Inviting me in was a profound surrender of control. "Just us?" I asked, my heart hammering a familiar, nervous rhythm. "Just us in the kitchen," she confirmed softly. "David and Sarah will arrive later. I want it to be entirely different this time. I need it to be different." I took a deep, steadying breath, looking out at the gray city skyline from my large loft windows. The fiery anger that had fueled my dramatic exit exactly 1 year ago had completely burned out, leaving behind a deep, aching desire for genuine connection. "Okay, Mom," I whispered, feeling the last remaining icy walls around my heart begin to melt. "I'll be there early. We can tackle the turkey together." The sigh of absolute relief on the other end was beautiful. Thanksgiving morning dawned crisp and incredibly clear. I pulled into the familiar gravel driveway, my hands entirely empty of magazines, my heart completely stripped of its heavy defensive armor. When I walked through the front door, the house smelled exactly as it always did, richly of roasting herbs and wood smoke, but the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of judgment was completely gone. I found my mother in the kitchen, wearing a simple apron over a comfortable sweater, her silver cane resting against the counter. She smiled warmly as I tied my own apron, immediately handing me a bowl of potatoes to peel. For 3 hours, we worked side by side in comfortable, companionable silence, interrupted only by quiet instructions and shared laughter over a spilled jar of sage. It was an entirely new, deeply foreign rhythm for us. There were no barbed questions about my future, no subtle, cruel comparisons to Sarah or David. As I was carefully basting the turkey, she opened a high cabinet and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. She placed it gently on the island next to my cutting board. "This was your grandmother's recipe box," she said, her voice wavering slightly with unshed tears. "I always thought I would give it to Sarah, because she seemed to appreciate our traditions more. But I was entirely wrong, Maya. You built a completely new life while fiercely holding on to your core values. That takes much more strength than blindly following tradition." She pushed the old wooden box gently toward my flower-covered hands. "It belongs to you." I stared at the faded wood, tracing the intricate carvings with trembling fingers. The acceptance I had desperately chased for 28 years hadn't come from a $20 million check. It came quietly, right here. The sharp, familiar chime of the doorbell broke the comfortable, quiet hum of the kitchen. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron, exchanging a soft, knowing look with my mother before walking down the hall to open the heavy oak door. David and Sarah stood on the porch, framed by the chilly November twilight. The immediate contrast to last year was striking. There were no boastful greetings, no immediate parades of professional accomplishments. David was dressed casually in a soft wool sweater, lacking his usual rigid suit jacket, and Sarah carried a simple, homemade cherry pie instead of her usual expensive store-bought pastry. "Hey, Maya," David said, offering a warm, surprisingly tight hug that lasted a few seconds longer than necessary. Sarah stepped inside, her usually sharp, perfectly contoured features softened by a genuine, albeit nervous smile. "It smells absolutely incredible in here," she remarked, taking off her coat. "Aunt Eleanor actually lets someone else touch the sacred turkey?" "We tackled it together," I replied, feeling a strange, wonderful surge of sibling camaraderie that I hadn't felt since we were little kids building forts in the living room. As they walked into the kitchen to greet my mother, I hung up their coats, taking a deep, centering breath. Exactly 1 year ago, I had stood in this exact hallway, my stomach tied in agonizing knots, clutching a glossy magazine in my bag like a secret weapon. I had been preparing for war. Today, the defensive armor I had worn for almost 3 decades was entirely gone. The house wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was just a house, and the people inside, with all their profound flaws and painful history, were just a family trying to figure out how to finally be a family. Moving into the formal dining room felt like stepping directly onto a haunted stage. The heavy mahogany table was set exactly as it had been 12 months prior, adorned with the same intricate lace runner, the identical polished silver cutlery, and the delicate crystal wine glasses catching the warm glow of the chandelier. I walked toward my designated seat near the end of the long table, the phantom echo of my chair scraping against the hardwood floor loud in my mind. I sat down, resting my hands flat on the cool linen tablecloth. David took his usual spot across from me, while Sarah sat to my left. Finally, my mother slowly made her way to the head of the table, heavily leaning on her silver cane, her breathing slightly labored, but her eyes remarkably bright. The physical layout was a precise, exact mirror of the worst night of my life, yet the energy vibrating in the room was entirely unrecognizable. There was no suffocating tension, no silent hierarchy being established before the bread rolls were even passed. As we began transferring the steaming dishes from the sideboard to the center of the table, the golden brown turkey, the fragrant stuffing, the heavily buttered green beans, the conversation flowed with a gentle, easy grace. We talked about David's new, smaller law practice, which was struggling but making him genuinely happy. We discussed the upcoming winter showcase for my coding mentorship program. The ghost of the Forbes magazine seemed to hover over my empty salad plate, an unspoken reminder of the massive explosion that had fractured us, but it no longer held any terrifying power. It was simply an old scar, deeply etched into the foundation of our new beginning. As the plates were filled and the warm hum of dinner conversation settled over the room, my mother gently tapped her silver fork against her crystal water glass. The delicate, ringing sound instantly silenced the table. My heart involuntarily skipped a beat, a deeply ingrained trauma response. I looked down at her end of the table, bracing myself. But when she spoke, her voice was incredibly soft, completely lacking the theatrical cutting edge of the past. "Before we begin eating," she started, looking slowly at each of our faces, "I want to say something important. For many years, sitting at this exact table, I equated love with achievement. I mistakenly believed that by demanding perfection, I was ensuring your happiness." She paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. David looked down at his lap, and Sarah remained entirely still. "Maya," my mother continued, turning her full, tear-filled gaze directly toward me. "A year ago, in this very room, I tried to humiliate you. I mocked the very passion that was keeping you beautifully alive. You answered me by proving your undeniable worth to the entire world. But the heartbreaking truth is, you never should have had to prove it to me." A hot, heavy tear slipped down my cheek, dropping silently onto my collar. "I am so deeply proud of the company you built," she whispered, her voice trembling with raw sincerity. "But I am infinitely more proud of the resilient, compassionate woman sitting at my table today. I am so sorry it took nearly losing my life to finally see you clearly. Thank you for giving me the precious chance to be your mother again." She raised her glass, her hand shaking slightly. "To Maya, and to second chances." The silence following my mother's toast was incredibly thick, but unlike the suffocating silences of my childhood, this one was woven with profound warmth and healing. I raised my own glass, my throat too tight with heavy emotion to utter a single word, and took a sip of water. As I set the glass down, Sarah cleared her throat softly. I turned to my cousin, expecting a quick change of subject to alleviate the heavy emotional weight in the room. Instead, Sarah looked directly at me, her eyes completely devoid of their usual competitive spark. "She's right, Maya," Sarah said quietly, her perfectly manicured hands fidgeting nervously with her linen napkin. "When you dropped that magazine on the table last year, I smirked." "But I need you to know, I wasn't smirking because I thought you were a joke. I smirked because I was entirely, fiercely jealous of you." I stared at her, genuinely shocked. "Jealous? Sarah, you're a brilliant doctor." "I became a doctor because it was exactly what was expected of me," she confessed, a deep, weary sadness leaking into her voice. "I followed the script flawlessly. But you? You ripped up the script. You built something out of sheer passion, completely in the dark, without any applause or approval. You were so incredibly brave, and I was so terrified of my own choices that I tried to make you feel small so I could feel bigger." David reached across the table, gently squeezing my forearm. "We all did," he added softly. "You were the only one of us who was actually free." Sitting there, looking at the broken, beautiful honesty on their faces, the absolute last fragments of my lingering resentment quietly dissolved into thin air. The rest of the evening unfolded in a soft, golden blur of genuine laughter and easy comfort. We ate until we were entirely stuffed, the heavy food somehow tasting infinitely better without the bitter side dish of familial judgment. When the meal was finally over, the usual routine would have dictated that my mother remained seated while she commanded us to clear the plates. Instead, it was an unspoken, collective effort. David carried the heavy turkey platter to the kitchen, Sarah carefully gathered the delicate crystal glasses, and I stayed behind to help my mother slowly rise from her chair. As we stood in the warm, brightly lit kitchen, washing and drying the fine china side by side, a profound sense of absolute peace settled over my soul. The rhythmic splashing of the warm, soapy water and the quiet clinking of the drying plates felt like a soothing domestic symphony. My mother handed me a freshly rinsed platter, our hands brushing briefly. "It was a good Thanksgiving, wasn't it?" she asked softly, hanging up her damp dish towel. "It was the best one we've ever had," I replied honestly, stacking the clean plate gently in the cupboard. I looked around the kitchen, feeling deeply anchored in the present moment. The $20 million buyout, the glossy magazine covers, the prestige, they were wonderful accomplishments, but they were no longer the absolute core of my identity. I had finally realized that true success wasn't about completely escaping your past or proving your painful critics wrong. It was about having the profound courage to return to the darkest, most broken places in your life, and quietly, patiently, helping to turn the lights back on. The drive back to my city loft that night was vastly different from the agonizing journey exactly 1 year prior. The icy, blinding clarity of anger had been entirely replaced by a warm, comforting glow of profound relief. I didn't grip the steering wheel with white knuckles. I rested my hands lightly, listening to a soft jazz playlist, watching the city lights blur into gentle streaks of gold. The heavy, invisible armor I had worn for almost 3 decades was finally unbuckled and left behind on my mother's polished hardwood floor. I realized as I pulled into my secure parking garage that holding on to resentment, even highly justified resentment, was exhausting. I had spent my entire adult life running away from the shadows of my family's expectations, using my startup as a desperate, frantic escape vehicle. But now the engine was finally quiet. Unlocking my apartment door, I didn't feel the sharp sting of loneliness that usually accompanied the sprawling, empty space. Instead, it felt like a true sanctuary. I walked over to the large floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the sleeping city below. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was a group text, a brand new creation from David, including Sarah and my mother. It simply contained a photo of the three of us from earlier that evening, smiling genuinely by the kitchen sink. No captions, no forced pleasantries. Just a quiet digital acknowledgement that we had survived the storm. I smiled, turning off the screen. December arrived in a flurry of pristine white snow and frantic, joyful preparation for my coding mentorship's winter showcase. True to her word, my mother had miraculously secured the grand ballroom at her prestigious country club. When I walked into the venue on the morning of the event, I was absolutely breathless. The massive room had been transformed into a brilliant, tech-forward wonderland, complete with sleek presentation booths for the young girls, professional lighting, and an elegant catering spread that far exceeded my humble budget. But the most stunning sight wasn't the expensive floral arrangements or the high-tech projectors. It was my mother, seated comfortably in her wheelchair near the entrance, directing the club's event staff with her old, familiar authority, but devoid of her former sharp condescension. She was glowing with a quiet, fierce pride. As the venue filled with excited teenagers, proud parents, and local tech leaders, I spotted David and Sarah near the back. David was actively helping a nervous 15-year-old debug a minor glitch in her presentation software, his usually stiff corporate demeanor completely relaxed. Sarah was deep in conversation with a group of aspiring female developers, passionately explaining how the medical field desperately needed innovative software engineers. They weren't just attending to appease me or to maintain a polite family facade. They were actively participating. They were genuinely showing up for my world, without trying to change it or measure it against their own yardsticks. Halfway through the showcase, I finally found a quiet moment to slip away from the bustling crowd and walk over to my mother. She was watching a particularly shy young girl confidently present a community organization app on the main stage. I pulled up a velvet chair and sat beside her, handing her a small cup of warm apple cider. "You completely outdid yourself, Mom," I whispered, gesturing toward the beautiful room. "This is beyond anything I could have ever imagined for them." She took the cup with a gentle, trembling smile, keeping her eyes fixed on the bright stage. It was the absolute least I could do, Maya. Watching these girls, seeing the absolute fire and determination in their eyes, it breaks my heart to think I spent so many years trying to extinguish that exact same fire in you. She reached out, resting her frail, soft hand over mine. When that magazine article came out, all those fancy corporate people celebrated you for making $20 million. But sitting here tonight, watching you build a ladder for these incredible young women to climb up right behind you, that is the true measure of your worth. The tears I had successfully held back all evening finally spilled over, trailing hot and fast down my cheeks. For 28 years, I had desperately wanted my mother to understand the complex code I wrote or the exhausting business I built. But I realized in that beautiful, brightly lit ballroom that she finally understood something infinitely more important. She finally understood my art. The monumental success of the Winter Showcase marked a beautiful, permanent turning point for my relationship with my siblings. We had finally stopped viewing each other as intense, lifelong competitors in a rigged race for our mother's fragile approval. Instead, we started acting like actual teammates. A few weeks after the event, David officially offered to handle all the complicated legal and tax paperwork to transition my mentorship program into a fully registered nonprofit organization. He insisted on doing it entirely pro bono, refusing my persistent offers to pay his firm's standard hourly rate. Consider it my long overdue investment in a guaranteed success, he had joked over a casual lunch, a stark, healing contrast to our painful encounter in the coffee shop months prior. Sarah, too, became an integral, permanent fixture in my life. She started volunteering as a guest speaker for my older students, brilliantly bridging the intimidating gap between medical science and software development. We began meeting for coffee every Sunday morning, not out of weary familial obligation, but because we actually enjoyed each other's company. We finally talked about our fears, our demanding careers, and the heavy, lingering ghosts of our shared childhood. We slowly dismantled the false, perfect narratives we had carefully constructed for decades, choosing messy, beautiful honesty instead. I wasn't just the eccentric, tech-obsessed little sister anymore, and they weren't the flawless, unapproachable golden children. We were just Maya, David, and Sarah. Years have passed since that infamous Thanksgiving dinner, and the heavy, glossy copy of Forbes magazine is now packed away in a dusty cardboard box at the very bottom of my closet. I don't need to look at it anymore. The young, fiercely determined woman on that cover, with her crossed arms and defensive glare, served her purpose. She survived the bitter cold of rejection and built a formidable fortress of success to keep herself safe. I am deeply, profoundly grateful for her. But the woman I am today no longer requires a fortress. My mother's health remains fragile, but her spirit is softer, kinder, and infinitely more present. Our family dinners are no longer a terrifying, highly orchestrated battlefield of silent judgment and passive-aggressive comparisons. They are loud, wonderfully messy, and filled with genuine, healing laughter. We still have moments of friction, old habits that occasionally flare up, but the foundational bedrock of our relationship is now built on unshakable mutual respect. Sometimes, when the house is entirely quiet and I am sitting alone by the large windows of my loft, I think about this staggering fortune sitting securely in my bank accounts. It bought me profound freedom, absolute independence, and the incredible ability to change the world for a few young girls. But the greatest, most invaluable asset I possess didn't come from a Silicon Valley buyout. My true wealth was forged in the quiet, agonizing space between a broken family and a forgiven heart.